What if Atlantis was never at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean? What if one of the most famous lost civilizations in history did not vanish beneath dark water at all, but under something else? Something just as vast, just as merciless, just as capable of erasing a world. Sand. For centuries, Atlantis has been imagined as a drowned kingdom resting somewhere beneath the sea. A golden civilization swallowed in a single night by earthquakes and flood. But what if that image has misled us from the very beginning? What if the true gateway to Atlantis was never hidden under the ocean, but exposed in broad daylight, buried in the heart of the Sahara Desert? It sounds impossible. Ocean and desert, flood and drought. A lost maritime empire in one of the driest places on Earth. And yet, once the clues are laid side by side, the idea becomes disturbingly difficult to dismiss. Tonight, we follow one of the strangest theories in alternative history, that the real remains of Atlantis may not lie beneath the Atlantic at all, but inside the colossal circular formation known today as the Eye of the Sahara. Welcome to Unmarked Sky. To understand this theory, we have to go back to the first major source for the Atlantis story itself, Plato. More than 2,400 years ago, the Greek philosopher described Atlantis in two dialogues, and Timaeus and Critias. He did not present it casually as fantasy. Instead, he framed it as an ancient account that had come down through Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who had reportedly heard it from Egyptian priests. According to that story, Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which places it roughly 11,600 years ago. That date matters, but we will come back to it. Plato says Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we now identify with the Strait of Gibraltar. It was described as a great island kingdom, powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced. Then came the catastrophe. In a single disastrous day and night, violent earthquakes and immense floods destroyed the civilization. Atlantis vanished, and what remained, Plato says, was an impassable region of mud and shoals, a place no sailor could easily cross. That final image shaped everything that followed, because once people heard that Atlantis sank, the search became fixed in one direction, the sea. For generations, explorers, archaeologists, and enthusiasts looked across the Atlantic world for a drowned city. The Bahamas, Santorini, southern Spain, even Antarctica. But no proposed site has ever fully matched the scale, structure, and geographic detail Plato described. And that raises a dangerous possibility. What if the problem was never that Atlantis was too hard to find? What if we were searching in the wrong environment entirely? The traditional image of Atlantis is simple: a lost civilization swallowed by the ocean. But that image depends on a very literal reading of what it means for a civilization to sink. What if Atlantis did not sink into water permanently? What if it was overwhelmed by catastrophe, buried by flood, then erased by time, climate collapse, and desertification? In other words, what if Atlantis did not vanish into the sea, but into a sea of sand? That is where the theory turns toward Northwest Africa, to a place in Mauritania known as the Far-Reachete structure, or more famously, the Fine Eye of the Sahara. Seen from the ground, it does not look extraordinary. Its full shape is simply too large to comprehend at human scale. But from the air, or better yet, from orbit, it is astonishing. A vast circular formation made of concentric rings, sitting in the middle of the Sahara like a giant target or a silent eye. For centuries, local nomads knew the region existed, but the structure only truly entered global awareness when astronauts photographed it from space in the 20th century. At first, scientists suspected it was an impact crater. That made sense. A massive, nearly circular feature in the desert naturally suggests a collision from above. But the evidence did not support that explanation. There were no convincing signs of shock metamorphism, extreme pressure effects, or impact-related transformation at the center. So, the crater theory weakened. Later, geologists proposed a different explanation, an uplifted geological dome formed by deep earth processes and slowly revealed through immense erosion over time. That remains the mainstream explanation today, and on its own, it sounds reasonable. But the mystery begins when this supposedly natural structure is compared point by point with Plato's description of Atlantis. Because the similarities are not vague, they are unnervingly specific. Plato's description of the capital of Atlantis is one of the most detailed passages in the entire legend. He says the central city consisted of alternating rings of land and water. At the center was a raised island where the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon stood. Around it were concentric circular channels and land bands repeating outward in a highly ordered pattern. 3 circular water rings, 2 circular land rings, a design unlike that of any normal ancient city. Now compare that to satellite imagery of the Eye of the Sahara. The resemblance is immediate. The Richet structure is not just circular, it is composed of multiple nested rings, clearly visible from above. If you already know Plato's description, the comparison is hard to ignore. Of course, similarity alone does not prove identity. Nature can produce surprising geometry. Humans are also good at seeing patterns. But then comes the next coincidence, and this one is harder to brush aside. According to Plato's account, the central island and surrounding rings of Atlantis had measurable dimensions. Scholars still debate the exact modern conversion of the ancient unit known as the stadion, but many estimates place the diameter of the capital as central ring system at roughly 23.5 kilometers. Now measure the inner ring structure of the Richet formation. It comes out to approximately the same size. That is where the theory becomes truly unsettling, because now we are no longer dealing with a general resemblance. We are dealing with a geometric structure in the Sahara Desert whose internal scale appears to match the dimensions Plato gave for the capital of Atlantis, a 2,400-year-old description, a desert formation visible from space, and a size alignment that lands in the same range. At that point, coincidence begins to feel inadequate, not impossible, but inadequate. And the match does not stop there. Plato says Atlantis was positioned beside a great plain, while mountains rose to the north. Those mountains, he says, sheltered the region from harsh northern winds and contributed to the land's favorable climate. Now look again at the Richet structure. To its north lies higher terrain, the Adria Plateau region. To its south, the land opens outward into flatter country. That is already interesting, but more important are the traces of water, because the biggest objection to any Sahara-based Atlantis theory is obvious. Atlantis was supposed to be a maritime civilization. The Sahara is one of the driest regions on Earth. How could the two possibly connect? The answer lies in deep climate history. The Sahara was not always desert. Around the same broad period often associated with the final age of Atlantis in these theories, North Africa was dramatically wetter than it is today. Scientists refer to this period as the Songhai-African humid period, sometimes called the Songrin Sahara. At that time, the region supported rivers, lakes, grasslands, and abundant animal life. What is now barren desert once held a far richer environment. And in Mauritania, radar imaging has revealed evidence of ancient river systems beneath the sands, including major channels that once flowed westward toward the Atlantic. That matters, enormously. Because if the Richard region once sat within a greener, wetter landscape connected to major waterways and coastal access, then the biggest immediate objection begins to weaken. The Sahara we know today is not necessarily the Sahara that existed when the Atlantis story was supposed to take place. That ancient environment would have looked very different, and if a major flood event later struck such a region, the destruction and subsequent burial could have erased almost everything visible on the surface. This is where the theory takes its boldest step. Atlantis may not have sunk in the simple image we inherited from modern retellings. It may first have been devastated by catastrophic flooding, then abandoned, then transformed by long-term geological and climatic change. As the climate shifted, the wet Sahara dried, the rivers vanished, grasslands collapsed, lakes retreated, sand advanced. What had once been a fertile zone could have become one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. If that happened over centuries, the civilization would not need to lie beneath the sea to become lost beyond recovery. It would only need to be overwhelmed, eroded, flattened, and entombed under time. That would also help explain why people searching for Atlantis under the Atlantic have never found the kind of city Plato described, because perhaps the remains were never underwater in the first place. Perhaps they were in plain sight all along, misidentified as a geological curiosity, a giant scar in the desert that no one recognized for what it might be. There is another layer to the theory, and it is one of the strangest. In Plato's account, Atlantis was ruled through a lineage connected to Poseidon, the sea godfather's 10 sons who divide the land among themselves. The eldest and greatest of them is named Phi Atlasi. From him, Plato says both the island and the surrounding ocean take their name. Atlas is already a charged figure in Greek memory. In wider mythology, Atlas becomes the titan condemned to hold up the heavens. But what makes this interesting is geography. The Atlas Mountains are in northwest Africa, and in some regional traditions from the broader Mauritanian world, local legends also preserve the name Atlas in connection with ancient rulership. If that is true, then a striking overlap appears. The founding ruler of Atlantis in Greek tradition and the mythic identity attached to the region near the richest structure both center on the same name. That does not prove anything by itself, but it creates the sense that multiple memory streams may be touching the same older pattern. Perhaps the Greeks preserved one version, local North African traditions preserved another, and over time both became myth. What if they were both echoing the same forgotten place? Plato also says Atlantis was rich beyond measure. He describes forests, fertile land, wildlife, even elephants, and he names a metal supposedly second only to gold in value, all rich outcome. For centuries, many assumed that was purely literary, a mythical metal to make a mythical civilization seem grander. Then metal ingots recovered from an ancient shipwreck near Sicily were analyzed and linked by some researchers to what the ancient world may have meant by aurichalcum, a copper-based alloy with a distinct warm metallic color. That discovery did not prove Atlantis, but it did show that Plato may not have been inventing everything wholesale. And again, the Richard theory looks for parallels. Mauritania is rich in mineral resources, copper, iron, gold. Plato also mentions red, white, and black stone used in the architecture of Atlantis. Supporters of the Richard hypothesis argue that these color correspondences also appear in the surrounding geology. One detail might be nothing, two might still be coincidence. But when the list keeps growing, rings, scale, mountains, plain, water history, atlas, metals, the theory gains emotional force. It starts to feel less like random pattern matching and more like an emerging map. Not proof, but a map. Then there is the date. Plato's timeline places the fall of Atlantis around 9600 BCE, or roughly 11,600 years ago. That date is extraordinary because it aligns broadly with one of the most dramatic transitional periods in late Ice Age Earth history. Around that time, the planet was emerging from the last ice age. Sea levels were rising, climates were shifting, entire ecosystems were changing. It also corresponds, in broad speculative discussions, with the period surrounding the Younger Dryas transition, a time of severe climatic disruption that some researchers have associated with extreme floods, rapid environmental change, and possibly even cosmic impact events. This part remains debated, but the symbolism is powerful. A great civilization destroyed in an age of sudden upheaval, floods remembered across cultures, mass extinction, geological violence, the collapse of an older world. From Noah's flood to Mesopotamian deluge traditions to other global flood memories, many ancient cultures preserve some version of overwhelming catastrophe. The Richard theory folds Atlantis into that same framework. In this reading, Atlantis did not vanish in a fantasy event. It perished in a real prehistoric disaster, one later remembered as myth. At this point, the strongest objection becomes obvious. If the Richard structure really was Atlantis, where is the city? Where are the streets, the walls, the carved blocks, the direct archaeological proof? That is a fair question, and it is the question that keeps the theory outside mainstream acceptance. Skeptics argue that a highly advanced civilization should leave unmistakable material remains. Supporters answer that the scale of destruction matters. If a settlement was devastated by flooding, then exposed to more than 10,000 years of wind erosion, sediment movement, and desertification, how much would realistically survive in recognizable form? Perhaps almost nothing on the surface. Perhaps only fragments, deeply buried layers, or disturbed traces, waiting for methods we have not yet fully applied. Stone tools found in the broader region already prove ancient human presence there. The question is not whether humans once occupied the area. They did. The question is whether beneath those older layers there may be evidence of something larger, older, and more organized than current models allow. That remains unproven, but it remains open, and that is exactly why the theory survives. One of the most haunting details in Plato's story comes from the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon. He tells the Greek lawgiver, in effect, that the Greeks are like children, young in memory, with no truly ancient traditions left intact. He says civilizations have been destroyed many times by fire and flood, and that Egypt preserved knowledge others lost. This matters because it reframes Atlantis completely. In that telling, Atlantis was not fantasy to the keepers of the record. It was history. Forgotten history, perhaps damaged history, filtered through myth, but history nonetheless. If that is true, then the Eye of the Sahara becomes more than a geological oddity. It becomes a candidate, a silent structure in the desert that may be the last visible landmark of a civilization swallowed not only by catastrophe but by human forgetfulness. So was Atlantis really in the Sahara? No one can say that with certainty. Mainstream geology still treats the Richat structure as a natural formation. Mainstream history still treats Atlantis as myth, allegory, or philosophical fiction, and yet the parallels remain. The rings, the scale, the mountains, the plain, the ancient waterways, the date, the name Atlas, the memory of flood. Any one of these could be dismissed. Taken together, they create something much harder to ignore. Maybe Atlantis did not sink into the ocean. Maybe it drowned, was broken, and was later erased by desert. Maybe the greatest lost city in human imagination was never hidden in darkness beneath the Atlantic, but under the full glare of the sun, waiting in silence inside the largest desert on Earth. If that is true, then the Eye of the Sahara is not just a geological formation. It is a question directed at history itself. What else have we misunderstood simply because we inherited the wrong image? This is Unmarked Sky.